And let me say, I don't doubt that the climate is warming. What I'm questioning that every change associated with climate warming is negative.
Welcome. I am Anders Bolling, and this is Mind the Shift, a podcast about a shifting world and an integrating humanity. A shifting world also means a changing natural environment. Almost 8 billion people should have a larger ecological footprint on the Earth than 3 or 4 billion, which was the global population 50, 60 years ago. Or maybe it's not inevitable. My guest today is Josef Reichholf. He's a German zoologist, evolutionary biologist, and ecologist. He was an honorary professor at the Technical University of Munich from 1974 to 2010. He has headed the State Zoological Collection in Munich and is a past board member of World Wildlife Fund Germany. Reichholf studied biology, chemistry, geography, and tropical medicine at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, obtaining a doctorate of science in 1969. He has written several books, of which some are considered controversial, like False Prophets about our attraction to disasters. He has a non-alarmist stance in the climate debate that has made him popular in certain camps and unpopular in others. Welcome to the show, Josef.
Thank you for invitation. I'm happy to give some answers to your questions as far as possible. I can do it.
I'm very happy to have you on the show. I don't know what the weather is like down in southern Bavaria today, but have you seen any butterflies today, Josef?
Just a few. This year we have very few butterflies, despite the fact that the weather is quite fine now. We had a terrible weather in May and June, and these 2 months are both essential for the butterfly populations.
Okay.
Of the year.
Yes, because I know that one of your main the fields of research is the studying of butterflies. I hope that's correct.
Yes.
Yes and no.
Zoological sense, I'm studying more moths, the night-flying Lepidoptera, which are much more numerous with respect to species and also much more important, for instance, for birds as food objects. The caterpillars of the night-flying moths are the staple food for insectivorous birds.
Yes, I wanted you to tell us a little bit about the importance of butterflies or moths, as you say, that group of insects, because you know so much about it. And I mean, everybody loves a butterfly, of course. They're considered beautiful. But can you tell us a little bit more about their significance? What makes them so special?
Well, there are at least 3 central points with respect to the importance of butterflies and moths. The first one I have already mentioned is the ecological function, being staple food for many organisms, especially birds, but also for insectivorous mammals. The second one is many species are pollinating the diverse flowers. They are night flying, and we don't see what they are doing during the night. And also a very important aspect is the value for many people. They are very fine, very pretty animals, and many people are fond of butterflies and moths, and I wouldn't like to see them gone for the sole reason of
their beauty, their
cultural effects. which are the most dangerous factors affecting the abundance and distribution of butterflies and moths.
So they are threatened, as would you say?
Yes, they are very much loved by people, and they are very important in nature.
We'll come back to the question of the threat against species and insects and so, but butterflies are fascinating. I have the impression here in Sweden that the number of butterflies has gone down a little bit, but it seems to go up and down year by year a little bit. And I saw a very beautiful one just the other day that I hadn't seen before, and it was all black with white. The side, just the outer side of the wings was white or yellowish white, but it was all black. It was quite big. I never saw that before.
Grauer Mantel.
Okay.
I don't know in the moment the English word for it.
What was it again in German?
Trauermantel.
Trauermantel. Okay. Oh, I think it's, yeah, I know the Swedish word now. Sorgmantel. Oh, okay. Well, I don't know the English word either. So anyway, that's fascinating. So much about butterflies right now. Can you go back a little bit in time now and tell us about your, I mentioned your CV a little bit in the beginning. I hope I didn't miss any important parts of it. Can you tell us a little bit about your early days as in the ecological field, so to speak? I mean, you were among the founders of a group called Gruppe Ecologia in the 70s, and this developed, as far as I understand, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but it developed into what was called Bund, and which in turn, I understand, led to the formation of the German Green Party. So how was the discussion in those days, and what were your driving forces?
Well, in those days, The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was certainly the most important book which has influenced the ecological movement. And the first people who came together to form a new initiative for conserving nature was this group of ecologists, as they call them, Gruppe Ecologie. And after a few years, it became clear there must be more than a loose association of some professors and TV people. And the UND has been founded, and I has been very happy at that time. But then I had to see it and had to acknowledge the trend which overtook the movement. At first, the anti-atomic activations, especially strengthened by the Chernobyl super-GAU, and afterwards it became an ideology. And as a scientist, as a natural scientist, I try to remain
unbiased,
not biased by ideology. For me, the facts are accounting. Maybe I give an example. Birds, mammals, even butterflies and moths are more abundant in towns and cities than in the countryside. And this is a fact which means to me we can't say the city is bad and this development of cities have to be confined and restricted, and the countryside is good even when it is full of cornfields, of maize fields, or other extensive stretches of intensive agriculture where no animals and plants are living anymore. And this is one example how ideology, which became the green ideology, became in contrast to the ecological facts and to a scientific position. And that's why I was withdrawing myself from these activations.
Would you say there was a rift between you and your fellow ecologists, your colleagues on the ideological side, so to speak? That there was a rift opening between you?
Yes, an opening over time. At first, a very small one, but it was increasing and increasing. And after a few years, I had to accept the fact that that is not what I am meaning with ecological research and with strategies to save nature.
Mm-hmm.
I changed my mind and went over to WWF and was for a number of years in charge of higher positions in the German WWF activities. And then for purely scientific reasons for my own research, I withdraw also from WWF without any conflicts with the aims and the habits of these internationally active nature conservation agency.
Okay, but were the reasons the same when you left WWF, that you felt that they were more ideological than you wanted to be, or was there something else?
Only to some degree. WWF very soon came to the train which was becoming was moving even faster with climate change, and I could see that many actions, also sponsored by WWF, were without results for nature, because having activities against climate change, maybe it is worthwhile for some distant future, but in the moment the problems are much greater in conservation of species, of habitats, and of changing the way habitats are destroyed. And that has been the problem with which I have been confronted in the last 5 or 6 years. I have been working with WWF, and then I that it's enough. I leave these organizations, which are political ones, and remain an independent scientist, which means I myself can change my mind because the facts are so strong and so clear that I have to change my mind. If it is good for me, for my former strategies and presentations or not, I have to accept the facts.
Yeah, I understand. Are we talking about now, when you left the WWF, are we talking about the 1990s or what year?
It's around the year 2000 and the early ones of the new century.
Okay. Yes, because you were mentioning that they were talking more and more about climate change. And as far as I remember, that was not really a big thing until maybe late 1990s.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So let's delve into that a little bit then, because you are also known for having said things about climate change that are not mainstream, or what you might call it. I mean, there are, of course, a range of scientists having all kinds of opinions, but you know as well as I do that there is a narrative that is the big narrative, that climate change is acute and very dangerous and all that. But so if we delve a little bit into it, what would you say, having a non-alarmist view on climate change, what would you say are the main flaws, the main mistakes in the mainstream narrative around this?
Well, I try to condense my thoughts on a few topics. First, climate and climate science are physical sciences. It is a matter of fact that at 0 centigrades, water is melting or freezing, depending on the direction of the moving of temperature. That's very okay, and there's no discussion about it. However, applied to living systems, the things are changing. Organisms, habitats, environments are adjusting to temperature and humidity precipitation regimes. They are adjusting within their bodies. They are adjusting with their performances. And that's a very important point in my view. For not a single major organism, purely temperature is the limiting factor. Temperature is something like a means, but it is not essential for living. Of course, we have to set aside the extreme temperatures like deep freezing or boiling hot water. That's clear. Mm-hmm. But changes within tens of centigrades on average mean nothing for most organisms. They have to live with the real temperatures, the change of real temperatures from day to night, over the seasons and over the years. And the fluctuations are much greater than the changes in the averages. The second point is temperature in its present distribution over the world or over a specific region is an artifact. It is artificially created by several stations where temperature is drawn from
measured.
Yes, from apparative measurements. However, when I, as an ecologist, go into the field in order to make measurements, I receive an endless variety of different temperatures each day. You can go out into the garden and the temperature which is shown there is different from the official, from the next meteorological station. I can go down with the thermometer to the bottom into the upper soil or into the grass simply, and it's different from the official measurements. I go into the sun, I go into the shade, into the forest, into a cornfield or whatever you want, right around the corner of a house, and you have different temperatures. And the problem is to make sense of all these differences. The network of stations where temperatures are measured is quite dense now, but it has been very open with large tracts of landscapes and vast distances across the oceans where no temperature measurements have been available in the 19th century. We have here in Bavaria, in southern Bavaria, one of the oldest meteorological stations on the summit of a mountain south of Munich, which is nearly exactly 1,000 meters in height, the Heisenberg station. And the temperature measurements from the Hohen Heisenberg station show they started in 1780. They cover the whole of the 19th and, of course, 20th and as far as we are now, 21st century. And if we look at the measurements of the Hohen Heisenberg station, there are great fluctuations in the annual temperatures. The averages for the summer or the winter temperatures. But over the stretch of 140 years, or 240 years, there is no trend.
No trend at all.
No trend. The trend shows up if we start in the middle of the 19th century, because it was a minimum. The turn of the 18th to the 19th century has been very warm, with summers nearly as warm as in the end summers of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
For the whole stretch, there is nearly no trend available, and the distribution and abundance of animals, which are at least to some degree sensible to temperature, like butterflies or like lizards and some snakes, shows us they have been much more abundant in the cooler 18th and 19th century than at present during the warmer times. Why? The simple reason is vegetation on ground level is now much denser due to the artificial supply with nitrogen and phosphorus compounds. Plants are much more intensive growing and therefore transpirating water, which cools down the habitats close to the surface where most of the sensible animals are living. The warmth-loving animals are decreasing in our time, despite the fact that on the front, like in Scandinavia, there is some gain in area of distribution, but in the core areas, much more in southern regions, the cooler habitats close to the ground are much closer to the cooler situation in former centuries than as a result of the increase in average temperatures in our time. And I could keep on telling.
Yeah. It's a bit complicated, I guess, for people who are not used to thinking in these terms, but I kind of get what you're saying. But I was going to mention Scandinavia because, as you know, I can understand also that the network of measurement stations, of meteorological stations, is very crucial in to this matter, because I mean, if you have many stations, you can get another average than if you have a few stations, which we had before, and all that. So that's important. But on the ground, you can see some changes. You can see, for instance, that since 1979, the summer ice around the North Pole has diminished quite a bit, and you can also see that. And I think these are actual factual things that they have found in Sweden, for instance. The last day of frost in the spring is now about a week earlier than it was 50, 60 years ago, and the first day of frost in the fall is about a week later than it used to be. So they can see some changes, and there is also this the forest limit in the mountains in northern Sweden is slowly climbing upwards, which is an indication that it's getting a little bit warmer. So what do you think about those changes on the ground that you can actually see?
Well, that's every example is okay, certainly. But there are in the background effects of human induced changes on the ground. The form of forest management has changed. There have been planted new forests, for instance, in Norway, further north than in former times. Grazing has been abundant in large areas, grazing by sheep. The land use change is also very significant, and it is very, very difficult to separate land use changes from pure climate changes. And let me say, I don't doubt that the climate is warming. What I'm questioning that every change associated with climate warming is negative. A lot of changes are quite favorable for nature or for agriculture too. And these other sides are not respected in the when we have to evaluate the changes and the activities against the changes. It is something like an economic weighting. What should we do? How effective is it? And my criticism is we have spent a lot of money, obviously without success, fighting climate change, because the amount of carbon dioxide which is set free into the atmosphere is still rising. For what has this huge mass of money been good? Would it have been better to spend it in ecological activities on the ground, for planting more forests or for changing the forest usage, which is common in Scandinavia as well as in Central Europe? It is agroforestry. It is a type of intensive use of forest production and not intended to use the forest as carbon dioxide sinks. If we would like to have these effects in the forest, we would give them much more chances and much larger amounts where they can grow without forestry usage of the forests. This is just one of many other examples. The type of agriculture which is characterizing the European Union is so destructive and sets such a large amount of CO2 free that changing agriculture would have been much more effective in fighting against climate change than what we call in German an Ablasshandel, which has been in former times, in medieval times, paying for the sins we have had committed to enable the soul to come into heaven. And much of in the last 10 or 20 years of our activities fighting climate change is quite close to such a type of not working money spending. And we see after 3 decades of spending very, very much money, the effects have been so small that they are next to nothing.
Yeah, that's a punch in the face for much of the climate change politics that's going on. I know that one of the most fascinating things I've seen you have said and written about is this that you are mentioning here, the fact that not everything can be negative about a slight warming of course, I mean, a 6-degree warming would perhaps be catastrophic, but 1 or 2 degrees, to me, it's also nonsense to say that everything has to be bad about it, because you have pointed out, for instance, the simple fact that if you look at the abundance of species around the poles and compare it to the abundance of species around the equator, it's completely obvious that species love warmth more than they love cold. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, the way you have put that?
Well, there is only one important trend against this rule, and these are the marine mammals. There are more marine mammals in much larger natural populations close to the poles in the oceans than in equatorial waters. That's due to the amount of food which is available. But the general trend is clearly more species, much more species towards the equator, and declining biodiversity from the equator, from the warm regions to the cold ones. And the ice ages have been destructive for species richness, not only in Europe, but also in North America, and to a small degree also in the southern parts of South America. And after the rewarming, species could increase in their distributional areas and increase in numbers, and they would have been increasing still further on if mankind would allow that. Mankind is fighting against the species reoccupation of the areas which have been set free by the retreating glaciers. Again, climate alone is not the main factor. But if we see only climate change as the main factor, then we create a situation that the real causes are neglected and nobody acts against the real causes of destruction of natural variety and of also those parts of nature which are essential for us for using fresh water which is clean, or forests which we should have also for securing our future, for wetlands and so on. All these activities which have been the center for nature conservancies and conservation activities in the 70s and 80s have been declining under the impact of climate change. And that is a trend which makes me very uneasy.
So what are the real causes? What if you would pick two causes for the decline of habitats that we should fight instead of only fighting climate change? Which two would you choose?
Well, with respect to the European Union, the most destructive activity is agriculture. It is irresponsible that the European Union is competing with their overproduction of meat and also agricultural products like grain on the world market, dictates prices on the world market which are destructive for the third world, and all the people are crying, well, the poor ones in the southern hemisphere, we have to be kinder to them and so on. This is some sort of a lamentation which is really unethical. We should withdraw our huge amounts of agricultural subsidies and return to a local production which is based on the needs and demands of the local population. And we should, in some sort of a symbiosis, import from the surplus of products of the third world, which are growing there much better, like ananas or bananas. But is it really necessary that the European Union puts a lot of money in producing rice?
No, it's a good question.
Corn, for making biofuels, and importing foodstuff, soybean, for feeding cattle, which is housed in stables under really incredible conditions with respect to animal health and some kind of ethical form of meat production.
I guess the same can be said of the agriculture in the United States, Canada, Australia.
Yes, it's exactly. It's a copy of the American agricultural system.
Yeah. So that's a thing that we should fight instead of only focusing on climate change all the time. You mentioned before that when you left WWF and before that even the other organizations that were one reason was that they were becoming more political and was ideological. Would you say that the IPCC, the United Nations Climate Organization, is also politicized by now?
Yes, of course, it's big business, which is in the background. And as a matter of fact, the most important institution in Germany, the Potsdam Institute, is an institution by the state, by the government, and not an institution based on universities. We had a lot of climate scientists on the universities. Why haven't they been good enough for dealing with the problem? That I can't understand as having been a teacher on the Munich universities. I know there are excellent colleagues in this area, and we also had to see how important it has been in the past decades for receiving research funds to include in times of climate change.
Yeah.
It has been something like a magical key for opening the funding, and that is always disturbing, critical.
Potsdam Institute of Climate is known for its alarmism. They often come with reports that are very alarming.
They are crying because they need the money. And they are not funded, not institutions independently funded by universities. That's understandable, of course. But the question is, has it been really necessary? And is it good for the public reception of those activities? Is, as we see in the present corona crisis, is it not better to have the independent scientists from the universities and the medical institutions as a background for political decisions? That's for me a question which I would clearly answer in direction to the universities and the independent institutions.
Yes, one is inclined to concur with that, of course. So if we leave climate change for a second and talk a little bit more about your general view on ecology and the nature, one of your books that I've read a few years ago, so I can't remember exactly every part of it, but it's called Stable Imbalances, which is kind of intriguing because it sounds like a contradiction in terms. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that concept, stable imbalances?
Well, I tried it. It's basically quite simple. We are stable imbalances as a system. Our organism works far from equilibrium. It has to be far from equilibrium. When our body reaches equilibrium, we are dead. The permanent flow of energy enables living organisms to counteract the general physical trend of the second law of thermodynamics. And what is a matter of fact for every organism which is not in a dormant state, or deep frozen in liquid nitrogen, for instance, something like a conserve for special uses like sperm for fertilizing cows and the like. This is a special situation. Living organisms have to be far from equilibrium to maintain the internal well-balanced state. What has been wrong and is still going wrong is to transfer this internal balance into the outer worlds, the ecosystems as they are generally called. Ecosystems are not stable and haven't to be stable. They are the environment of organisms, but no ecosystem, not a single one, has a central regulation, which is typical for an organism. No ecosystem has a natural boundary, which is basically for every organism, it is separated from the surrounding. Ecosystems are separated by research aspects, but they are not entities who are themselves in nature. You can't see an ecosystem. You haven't certainly never seen an ecosystem pairing with another one and producing offsprings. This is obviously nonsense. But in nature conservation especially, and also in some parts of ecological science, ecosystems are treated like organisms. And this organism identity is a basic fault. It is wrong, deadly wrong. Ecosystems are always independent from the organisms which are living in, and the organisms have to be in imbalance with the ecosystems if they are to keep on working. That's a big problem, but it has a name. Following the Rio Earth Summit, have a name for this: sustainable growth.
Oh yeah.
Sustainable growth means change, means growth, but within limits which are tolerable, which are stable enough for being tolerable by the environment and also by the users for longer times. And if you look into the ecological textbooks, you won't find a definition for these kind of ideas.
Okay.
Are open for everybody's interpretation and therefore in effect meaning nothing. And that's a big point in ecological science and also with respect to nature conservations. We treat nature as if they had to be stable, unchanged. But nature was ever changing and will be changing. We have to live with changes. Everybody has to live with changes in his and her own life, which is changing from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, constantly.
The societies and always we are dealing.
So you mean it's a kind of an oscillation from high to low to abundance to less abundance, from life to death, constantly in nature? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
And we have to accept that.
Yeah, and there is no state of nature which is privileged, which is the right one. But there is a number of changes which are good for us. And we have to define what we mean with good for us and good for other organisms.
Maybe that can change over time as well.
Of course, we have to accept that.
But nowadays, people panic, when they hear about species are diminishing and some habitats are getting smaller and all that. They panic because they, like you say, they have this idea that nature has always been in balance, and now human beings are changing this balance. So would you say it's kind of a kind of hubris that we think that we are the cause of all evil in nature?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. I think what we call in German Machbarkeit, the makeability is in the background. People want to have the right and the possibility to make everything and to keep everything in a state they want to have it. That's the main problem. And if we look only a little bit down in history, into history, we will find no period of historical times up to our present where no changes have been happening.
Mm.
Not every change has been good, of course, but in the long run, we are happy that the world was changing into a state in which we are now living, isn't it?
Yes, and it makes the world and life a lot more interesting, doesn't it? When it's changing all the time.
Yeah.
Do you think people have too? Well, I guess you already answered this question. If people have too narrow a perspective on nature and the ecological systems, I guess you have said yes to that.
Yeah. This is a Western tradition. We have separated since the Enlightenment, at least, nature from mankind.
Mm.
This separation is nowhere so expressed and so predominant in our daily life than in Western culture. In Eastern Asia or in India, there are much more areas in which mankind and nature are integrating concerning respect of nature, concerning nearness of animals to people, and concerning also the relative value of humans compared to other living organisms. The spectrum over the populations of mankind is very large. One knows it that there are populations which try not even to destroy the life of an ant, and which are feeding rats and mice because they are living organisms. And on the other side, there is the Western society which separates the meat and the meat production from the fact that millions and millions of animals have to live to produce meat and are killed in an unhuman state, in a cruelty which is incredible for other people of the world. And, our hubris in the Western society is in this area especially pronounced.
Mm. Do you eat meat yourself, Josef?
Yes, I eat meat. I am not yet a purist saying every animal life is much more counting than plant life. We need proteins, and we use a lot of proteins which are produced by plants. My wife is a Japanese, and by tradition has another selection of food stuff, of course, than we have in Bavaria or in Europe. But and that I think is an important point. If we try to look what we are doing, then we receive some kind of positioning which to our habit of living, and not an absolute one like an ideology.
Okay. There is a lot of talk about what is called the sixth mass extinction event now. So talking about stable imbalances and the fact that there are actually many species are diminishing in numbers, not that is not to say that they go extinct completely, but they are diminishing in numbers. And so some ecologists and debaters and others, politicians as well, are talking about the sixth mass extinction event. What are your opinions about that concept? Is there such a thing going on?
Well, I think basically the facts are showing a general decline in species diversity and species abundance. And the smaller populations become, the greater is the risk of final extermination of the remaining populations which are too small to survive. What we know is roughly 1,000 species which have been exterminated in the past centuries. Dead as a dodo is not merely saying in English, but it is a fact that the dodo, the Dronte of Mauritius, has been destroyed by people and will come never again back into living. The other point is we know in effect more about the stars in the universe than about the richness of animal and plant species on the earth.
Mm.
Counting, numbering, and scientifically exploring species abundance is not a great science since many years.
Wow.
The zoologists and the botanists which are working on this subject are marginal in the science, in the realm of science. Why is it that numbering and giving an unknown species a name is
it's not prioritized in science?
Yes. And despite the fact that we know that a great number of species have been essential with respect to medicine, to fighting diseases like malaria or some other infectious diseases, we still are dealing with the diversity of nature as if it is something like a playground of beetle collectors or butterfly enthusiasts and so on.
So, are you saying that we basically don't know how many species there are out there? And
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
The talk about extinction is not really well founded in that respect, or what? Where are you aiming?
Yeah. What we should know is the real amount of extinction, but it is impossible to ascertain this facts if we can't research the areas which are going to be destroyed. For instance, tropical rainforests. In advance of the destruction, we can only calculate retrospective what might have been lost due to the fact that species richness is dependent on well-known factors like area size, isolation degree, and general richness of the type of habitat. And because we have calculated numbers of possibly extinct species in the process of the last decades, we are not able to show the public what species have been really gone. Mm-hmm. The giant panda or the large whales are species which can be presented as flagship species, as the environmentalists call them.
Yeah.
And if you have a small bird which can be localized, like a small warbler on the Seychelles Islands, then people are able to save this species. This has been done on several occasions, but if you don't know what is disappearing, you can't save it. And this is a big unknown fact in the recent debate concerning the sixth
Mass
extinction.
extinction.
Yeah.
It's a contentious issue, this thing about calculating how many small species might have gone. And there's been a bit debate going on about that for decades. And you were talking about flagship species, like big ones that we can see, the pandas and things like that. One type of animals that is not a flagship, that are not flagships, but have recently been in focus because there have been some studies showing that they are diminishingly drastically, at least in some parts of the world, that are insects. And now we're maybe full circle here, coming back to the moths and the butterflies.
Yeah.
I think it was in Germany, actually, that there was this very, very well-known and written about study that showed that at some point, somewhere there, close to, I think, to a natural reserve, the number of flying insects had gone down by about 70% during the last 2 decades or 3 decades or so. So how worried should we be about that insect, the amount of insects going down drastically like that?
May I add at this point that probably I've been the first one who has shown the severe decrease in insect abundance with light trap captures in my lower Bavarian area where I have been grown up from 1969 to 1996. And in this series of time, the numbers of night-flying butterflies decreased by 85% and of other small insects by 96%. On the margins of the villages where intensive agriculture is right in the neighborhood. In the city of Munich, I have made similar investigations in the 1980s and in the first decade of starting with 2003. And to our great surprise, numbers of species and the abundance of butterflies, of moths, night-flying moths, remain stable and are now on a higher level than out on the countryside in eastern Bavaria.
Oh, really? So there are more moths and butterflies within the city of Munich than in the countryside around it.
So
that's
is
fascinating.
it, despite the fact of the high light pollution, which is typical for cities like Munich with 1.5 million inhabitants. Of course, the lights are bright every night, depending not from moon and weather, they are always bright. Despite this fact, the night flying insects are more abundant than out on the countryside. And as a matter of fact, on the countrysides, the birds are decreasing. This year, I haven't heard a single skylark singing.
Okay.
I'm living close to the lower reaches of the River Inn in the border area between Bavaria and Upper Austria. I have a better chance here to see a white-tailed sea eagle than hearing a lark.
Oh, that sounds a bit tragic.
Fundamentally, the things have been changed. There have been great success in conserving birds and other animals and also plants along the watercourses. But we have lost the landscape, and the landscape which is used by agriculture makes up 55% of Germany. And what the Krefeld study, which you mentioned, has shown is very important in this context. The study has been conducted in areas, in small areas, which are protected, which are not used by agriculture. And despite the protection, the decrease in numbers in abundance has been so high, 75%. That means even our protected areas are not able to conserve what they should have conserved, because poisoning by agriculture and eutrophication by the excessive use of fertilizers affects also the nature conservation areas. Best off are the big cities. That's the situation. And I think we should severely think about these facts and ask the question, must this be the future of the symbiosis of the people and the highly subsidized countrysides where only a tiny fraction of the former peasant populations are now big farmers which are producing like under conditions of open industrial factories.
So we should be pretty worried then, but it sounds like the agriculture, the highly modern agriculture, is the culprit here.
Yeah, that's the central factor affecting not only biodiversity, but also the quality of life of our population. I think the Swedish population can't imagine how different the situation is in Central Europe, in these areas where agriculture has this high level of intensity. Sweden is a large country, especially in the northern parts. We don't have such northern parts. The alpine areas are full of people which are coming in summertime for holidays and in winter for skiing. Populations are simply too big for the small areas which are in something like a natural state and not under heavy pressure of agriculture.
Yes, I know. I've traveled around in Germany, so I've seen the density.
Yeah.
Okay, Josef Reichholf, it's been an education and a pleasure talking to you. Very, very interesting. I hope you can enjoy the rest of the summer and see some more butterflies, hopefully, in the area where you live. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
I have to thank also very much. It was a pleasure for me, and I hope I could be understood in the most important parts from my point of view. Thank you. Thank you very much.